Well, a very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. A great pleasure to see you. And although I have been looking forward to all of those sessions that we've had so far, perhaps if you forced me to pinpoint one that I have especially looked forward to, and if you forced me into a corner in that way, I would probably say it is this one. Let me try and share my presentation. Okay, to other people in the waiting room. We welcome Mr. Bazika from Prague and Monsieur Arthur Regnault from France, an alumnus of the Charles University Choir. So a very warm welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen. This is the session I have perhaps been most waiting for, as I said, and it is devoted to the interpretation of Monteverdi's Vespers of 1610, as they are colloquially known, but the correct title or the full title is Vespro della Beata Vergine, Vespers for the Blessed Virgin. It is a piece that I have a very strong personal association with. I have known and loved it since my early teens, so it will be a very great pleasure to talk about it. It is also a work that has several major musicological challenges, so it is very, very interesting indeed in that respect. But first, let me indulge in some personal recollections and associations with the work. Monteverdi was one of my very first musical loves, and at the age of, I don't know, but I heard Orfeo whilst I was in Montpellier as a schoolboy, performed very, very beautifully in a semi-staged performance at the Church of Notre-Dame des Tables in Montpellier, which you can see on the upper left-hand side corner. It was semi-staged, and the role of Orfeo was undertaken by the English tenor John Elwes, who is also a very fine tenor soloist in more than one recording of the Vespers, as we shall see. And with La Grande Écurie et la Chambre du Roi, conducted by Jean-Claude Malgoire. It was a magnificent performance that I dreamt about for a long time afterwards, and really one of my early treasurable musical recollections. Orfeo by Monteverdi happened to be also the very first thing I had the chance to conduct, and that was at the Dartington Summer School of Music when I was a 16-year-old one summer. Then, to come to the Vespers themselves, I had the privilege of conducting never so far the entire Vespers, which is a huge work, but the 6-part Magnificat from those Vespers. And I was able to do that in 3 very different places with 3 different sets of performers, all 3 treasurable experiences from which I have very dear memories. The first one was as an undergraduate at Sussex, then at Pembroke College, Cambridge, in the Wren Chapel. That's the chapel designed by the same Sir Christopher Wren who later designed St. Paul's Cathedral, and more recently in Prague with members of the Charles University Chorus, in fact, at the Aula of the Carolinum. But this was quite a few years ago, so perhaps members of the chorus who are following us now were not yet members when this happened. It must have been, I think, rather more than 10 years now. My special interest and affection for the music of Monteverdi is reflected by the fact that I founded and directed the Cambridge University Monteverdi Ensemble, and we were delighted to find out that the distinguished Swiss tenor, who was associated with the Monteverdi revival and recordings made with Nadia Boulanger in the 1930s of Monteverdi's Madrigals, was still alive He was 89 or 90 at the time. He lived to be 106. And we rather shamelessly and daringly wrote to him asking if he would become our honorary president, which he did. Now, he too is a very distinguished solo tenor in the Vespers, as we shall have occasion to hear. But what are Vespers, the service of Vespers? It's one of the offices, the divine offices, that is found in books of ours, particularly in the Latin tradition in this case, but there are analogues in the Byzantine tradition, in the Armenian tradition as well. And it is part of the Roman Catholic Officium Divinum. In Monteverdi's time, of course, the Vespers would have been said and sung in Latin. Typically, they would include 5 psalms, 1 hymn, and the Song of Mary from St. Luke's Gospel, the Magnificat. Of course, we have performed different Magnificats with the Charles University Chorus. Some of you may remember having done the Bach Magnificat with me and with our orchestra a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And in 2015, on the 24th of April, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the Charles University Chorus and Orchestra gave the Czech premiere of the Alan Hovhannes Magnificat. But within Vespers, the Magnificat is but one component of several that constitute this evening service. Now, the psalms for Marian feasts, because we said the Monteverdi Vespers are Vespers for the Blessed Virgin, they are devoted to the Virgin Mary. The Vespers start with Psalm 110, but Monteverdi would have known the Latin Vulgate, which is a particular version of the Bible, and in the Latin Vulgate, this psalm, in fact, in common with the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint and the Armenian Psalter, is Psalm 109. But I mentioned 110 because most modern Psalters, modern translations, use the numbering of the so-called Masoretic Bible. That's the Bible that is used in the Hebrew tradition, whereby it is numbered as Psalm 110. And the individual psalms and the Magnificat conclude with the doxology, giving glory to God, Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. And they include the hymn for Marian feasts, feasts devoted to the Virgin Mary, Ave Maris Stella. Now, the Vespers have antiphons as well. They are variable elements that can change with the liturgical occasion. They are usually inserted before and after each psalm and the Magnificat, and they reflect the particular feast that is being celebrated, and they tend to link together the Old Testament to Christian theology. The service ends with a blessing. On ordinary Sundays, Vespers might be sung in Gregorian chant, but on high holidays, such as the feast of a patron saint or the Virgin Mary, elaborate concertante music was performed using instrumental groups, solo voices, and elaborate choral settings as well. Now, in his Vespers, Monteverdi may have offered such music without necessarily expecting that the whole volume that he published would be performed in a given service. As we shall see in a moment, there is some controversy about this. And moreover, Monteverdi in his publication deviated from the typical Vespers liturgy by adding motets or concerti, sacred concertos as they were known, between psalms. And scholars for a long time have not been in agreement as to whether these little motets and pieces, solos, duets, and so on, were intended to replace antiphons sung as Gregorian plain chant, or whether they were entirely independent pieces. And in his Vespers, Monteverdi also included the Marian litany, Sancta Maria ora pro nobis, Holy Mary, pray for us. All the liturgical texts set by Monteverdi, those that are unequivocally parts of Vespers, they were set in a traditional way, the so-called prima pratica, in some ways conservative way, you might say, using their psalm tones in Gregorian chant, and often using a cantus firmi. Cantus firmi, a cantus firmus, is a piece of plain chant that serves as a sort of core theme around which there's polyphony that creates a rich texture. These are the psalms that are included in the Monteverdi version of the Vespers of 1610. The Lord said unto my Lord, praise ye the Lord, O ye servants of the Lord. I was glad, except the Lord build the house and praise Jerusalem. So all this is included. Now, let us continue by looking at Monteverdi's Vespers. So we saw which psalms are included, and you can see them in this table, but you can see that they are, as it were, interleaved with those motets. You can see that we have two from the Song of Songs from the Old Testament, a motet that uses a passage from Isaiah and the Gospel according to St. John. Audi Celum is an anonymous poem. We already mentioned the hymn Ave Maris Stella. Now, the volume was published in Venice with a dedication to Pope Paul V. The dedication is dated to the 1st of September 1610, and the title is slightly ambiguous. It says, Sanctissime Virgini missa senis vocibus, ac vespere pluribus decantande, cum nonulis sacris concentibus, ad sacella sive principum cubicula accommodata. Mass for the Most Holy Virgin for 6 voices. The Mass is not part of the Vespers, so we can forget about that for our present purposes. And Vespers for several voices, with some sacred songs suitable for chapels and ducal chambers. And the question is whether those sacred songs are meant to be part of the Vespers, or whether the Vespers are to be used in a church, whereas the sacred songs are completely independent to be used on private occasions in other spaces. So that's one of the controversies that meant that a lot of ink was spilt in musicological circles for most of the 20th century. Monteverdi composed the music whilst he served as a performing musician and composer for the Gonzagas, the Dukes of Mantua. But we have no definite information about any performance. Did he perform it in Mantua, or did he perform it in 1613 when he became appointed as director of music in Venice? It seems likely that he did perform it in Venice, but we don't have positive information. As you can see, there are 13 movements, and the collection offers a choice between 2 different settings of a Magnificat, one for 6 voices and the other one for 7 voices. Now, performances in church would have included antiphons in Gregorian chant for the specific feast day, if the Vespers were used for occasions other than the Blessed Virgin. And there is a theory to that effect as well that I may briefly mention later on if time allows. And I mentioned that the psalms were set in a conservative way according to the so-called prima pratica, but the other items demonstrate the seconda pratica, which we find in opera. And in a very magnificent way, Monteverdi has succeeded in marrying these two together. The scoring is for up to 10 vocal parts. Again, whether they are solo parts or larger choral groups is a matter for discussion. And the instrumental body includes cornetti. These are very different instruments to brass cornets that you find in modern symphony orchestras. These make a much more mellow and vibrant sort of very characteristic sound. Violins and viole de braccio, which are not quite the same as violas, they're more like viols. And the so-called basso continuo, which would have been organ, perhaps harpsichord, perhaps harp, various plucked instruments. Again, there has been much discussion as to what might be appropriate in modern day performances of Vespers. The work received a lot of attention in the 20th century, having been largely forgotten. And one thing that merits discussion is whether it was a planned composition in a modern sense, as an oratorio or a mass by, say, Beethoven or someone like that, or is it just a loose collection of music suitable for Vespers, for performers to choose from? And what is the role of the additional movements, the concerti, the motets that are not an integral part of a Vespers service, issues of instrumentation, and even musical keys? There are controversial aspects, which I shall try briefly to discuss in a moment. Metrical relationships, how one section of the music relates to the next in terms of the pulse of the music. And it is interesting that the first recording that was released of the piece was incomplete. It had only excerpts, and it was released in 1953. But two more ensued in the same year. And there are very many recordings of the work available now. We shall sample some of them together later this evening. Most editions and recordings try to include all the Vespers music printed in 1610, including the motets, the concerti, but not the Mass, because no one claimed that the Mass should be performed together with the Vespers. That would not make liturgical sense. Some recordings and performances add antiphons for a particular occasion of the church year to create a complete liturgical Vespers service. Some add antiphons of Gregorian plain chant, in addition to including all the motets and concertante pieces. So they as it were, cover those items, perhaps, if you will, twice over. Others strictly present only the printed music. And even before one contemplates performing the piece or producing a new edition, there are a lot of fundamental decisions that have to be made. Some of the issues I've already hinted upon. One is a matter of instrumentation and scale. And as we saw a few weeks ago in connection with our discussion on the Bach Mass in B minor, there is the issue, should one use a small group of singers, perhaps one voice per part, in which case one would have a maximum of 10 voices performing at a time, or should one have massed voices? It's extremely effective to perform the Vespers with a substantial chorus and have an alternation between solo bits and choral sections. Now, on that subject, perhaps the most reliable scholar was Dennis Stevens, who also produced a magnificent edition of Monteverdi's extant correspondence. And Stevens felt that, of course, towards the end of the 20th century, it has become fashionable to perform all their music generally using smaller forces and smaller choirs, chamber choirs, or even solo voices, and smaller instrumental groups. But Dennis Stevens had an unrivaled knowledge of the documentary witnesses of the time, including correspondence between Monteverdi and various others, bills of payments to musicians, and so on and so forth. And he felt that the pendulum of fashion had swung too far in the direction of everything being small, smaller scale. And he even rather humorously, and you will see why I've got a photograph, or an image, sorry, a picture of a mouse in a cathedral above. He rather acerbically wrote that only a chamber group of instruments, particularly old instruments that are rather quieter than modern counterparts, that such a tiny group of chamber group of instruments was never used in the Basilica of St. Mark, where Monteverdi was director of music from 1613 until 1643. For the simple reason, and I'm quoting Dennis Stevens, these are not my words, that the size and acoustic would make any one of them sound like a mouse breaking wind. And that is not what the composer wanted. Dennis Stevens was known for his humorous turn of phrase. Perhaps the image of a mouse farting in a cathedral is not the most elegant one. But if anyone were to tell you that only a tiny group of instruments ought to be used for the Monteverdi Vespers, they are unlikely to be right. And in fact, you get the same impression when you visit the Basilica of St. Mark's in Venice, which is a huge and magnificent space. The second controversy has to do with instances such as you can see on the lower part of this slide, where there's a sort of time signature. You see that it's an alla breve sort of sign, a C with a vertical line through it and 3-2, a change in meter compared to what we started with. And you find this in most of the movements. And there are various ways of relating the movement that came before with the movement after. Should we have the same beat kept invariant, the same tactus, as it were, and change the tempo accordingly to preserve the same beat? Or should the beat become longer, but the smallest unit of notation be kept invariant? We have similar dilemmas, in fact, with Janacek's operas and with works such as Taras Bulba, with different conductors adopting different solutions. Now, Dr. Roger Bowers, under whom I had the honor of singing as an undergraduate, was kind enough to discuss these things with me. I was an 18-year-old and I wanted to know. And I knew that he conducted Monteverdi and I wanted to ask him why he did this or that. And he gave me explanations, but my understanding is that he transferred theories of practices that are likely to be true and valid for English polyphony in the realm of Italian music of a slightly newer period. And for the Vespers, Roger's theories do give us plausible results, but even then, as an 18-year-old, I went to him with my score of Monteverdi's L'Incoronazione di Poppea, one of his late operas, and said, yes, but if I apply your theory here, this result is very odd because it means that the next section has to be absurdly fast. And he said, oh, yes, this work has not yet been generalized to embrace opera. So some of these theories have not yet met with universal acceptance, let us say. it was a delight to meet Roger Bowers at the Medieval and Renaissance Music Conference in Prague 2 years ago. I didn't ask him how his ideas had evolved on this, but he is one of the major contributors to our understanding of this technicality. It is not, of course, merely a technicality, because the music sounds very different depending on which solution you use for such dilemmas. And that is reflected in the diversity of choices made in various recordings and performances. There's another controversial thing, and that is quite a recent thing. It emerged in the 1980s when some scholars, of which most prominent was the conductor and musicologist Andrew Parrott, who published an important article in the Early Music magazine in 1984 regarding transposition. You see, Monteverdi, when he notated the music, for some movements, he used a different sort of clef, a different sort of notational device, a different key. Some of you will know the G clef and the F clef. There are other clefs as well, but in Monteverdi's time, there would be, in addition to the chiavi naturali, the natural clefs, so-called chiavetti. And the theory is that movements notated with the latter perhaps ought to be transposed down an interval of a fourth, in which case the music becomes rather lower in pitch. Now, Parrott used some rather compelling arguments, which I remember finding convincing at the time. You would find that those movements that require transposition, according to his hypothesis, they would be unusually high unless they were transposed. And if you transpose them down, you find very close analogies between some excerpts and other pieces by Monteverdi. For example, between a Gloria for 7 voices that he composed and bits of the 7-voice Magnificat. And even more compellingly, Andrew Parrott found some keyboard instruments that allowed transposition by a fourth. If you look at this picture on the extreme right-hand upper corner of this slide, that is such a harpsichord. And in case we have anyone listening from Scotland, such an instrument has been preserved, and I believe in working order, at the University of Edinburgh. So the arguments are rather compelling, but when you apply it and you listen to recordings that transpose the movements in question, it's mostly, I think, the Lauda Jerusalem and the Magnificat, down a fourth, as suggested by Monteverdi's use of those special clefs, the result is a bit of a letdown. It's a little disappointing. It's a little underwhelming, you might say. Although maybe one of the reasons for that is that probably, even though we are used to performing Baroque music at instruments that are tuned a little lower than modern concert pitch, there's evidence to suggest that musical pitch in Venice was, if anything, rather higher than modern pitch. So maybe if you take account of the fact that the pitch may have been higher to start with, it won't sound so low if you transpose that down a fourth. And the final controversy has to do, as I mentioned, with the function of the so-called motets, whether they belong to the piece or not. And Dennis Stevens claimed in the preface of his Novello edition of the Vespers that the concerti, though they were in the same original publication of 1610, they were extraneous, they were not intended to be included in performances, they were only for princely chapels, and he produced an edition like that, that excluded those movements. He even recorded the piece in, I think, 1966 or 1967, like that, and it does work. But I remember as a student, as a schoolboy, in fact, ordering from the United States and getting, to my delight, a very interesting collection of essays by Jeffrey Kurtzman, published in 1978, and this is its cover on the lower right-hand side of this slide. that demonstrated really beyond doubt that those other pieces could indeed have been included as substitutes for Gregorian chant, substitute antiphons. He found other Italian collections where explicitly comparable pieces were intended to serve such a purpose. So that rather settled it, it seemed. And some years later, Denis Stevens retracted his earlier thesis and claimed that he had been driven partly by practical considerations preparing a performance of the Vespers for Westminster Abbey or Westminster Cathedral, I'm not sure, one of those, which did not have public lavatory facilities. So he wrote that he was under pressure to keep the duration of the performance short, and so it was expedient to exclude these. What he really thought, we don't know, but we know that already in 1967, when he wrote the sleeve notes for the first Corbeau's recording, which I'll play you something of in a few minutes, of the Vespers, despite his very, let's say, aggressive position in favor of the exclusion of the motets from Vesper performances, he actually spoke very highly of the overall construction of a work that integrated those motets into a Vespers performance, as in that recording. So he may have been rather more open-minded after all. His most, let us say, militant position was expressed in a famous essay of 1961 in the Musical Quarterly, Where Are the Vespers of Yesteryear? So all this takes us to the subject of the editions available. Now, I said the Vespers were forgotten, but they were not entirely forgotten, because there is an article by von Winterfeld, published in 1834, that has brief excerpts from the Vespers by Monteverdi as musical illustrations. And the conductor Molinari also published excerpts in 1919. But the first complete version was published by Malipiero, the great Italian composer, who in fact edited and published the complete works by Monteverdi. The Central European refugee to England, Hans Redlich, had assisted Malipiero to prepare his edition in the 1930s, and in 1934 he published a different edition which was based on the Malipiero version. Or rather, he prepared his own edition that I think was used for performances, but it was published not before 1949. But already in 1955, he prepared a new edition that was based on the original material from 1610 and not founded on the Malipiero edition anymore. I mentioned the Denis Stevens edition of 1961 for Novello that had many reprints, one of which I acquired as a schoolboy. The conductor Jürgens produced a new edition with an elaborate orchestration, which I also proceeded to acquire. But a more rigorous and musicologically acceptable edition was by Gottfried Wolters. He had published a partial edition in 1954, but the one I have in mind is in 1966, which I acquired as a first-year undergraduate, although it was published much earlier in 1966. I stress this lest you should think that I was an undergraduate in 1966. This edition also uses a method, a typographical method, known as Mensurstricht, of which you can see an example here on the lower right-hand corner of the slide, whereby the bar lines don't intersect with the musical staves, so that the notation can be preserved, where you've got a dotted note. Instead of using a note of lesser value and tying it across the bar, you can preserve the visually vivid analogies and imitations, as you can see here. So within a bar, there's a dotted minim and a crotchet. Here, though, a bar would interrupt, so we would have to change notation, and that would make the edition less obvious. So that was a feature of the edition that I was particularly fond of. Clifford Bartlett, the late Clifford Bartlett, whom I had the privilege of knowing a little, having submitted an article some years ago, which he very kindly published in his early music recordings magazine, he produced editions of Monteverdi's works that were based on the Malipiero publications, but which were annotated to make full use of current musicological knowledge. The Malipiero edition, a lot of people have looked down upon it, but unlike the Redlich and some of the other later editions that were really very heavily edited, Malipiero's editions are almost urtexts, because he did not add much. In fact, he added he didn't add anything at all, more or less, to what there was in the original music, and people on the contrary criticized him for not offering enough guidance. But perhaps we've gone full circle. I'd say that Malipiero editions are really rather fine, although, of course, I would urge you to use one of the very best modern editions, and there's more than one that can be had now. One of them is that by the late Jerome Roche, which I was one of the first people to acquire. It's an Eulenburg score, very rigorous and very clearly presented. And then Dennis Stevens produced a revised edition for Novello where he incorporated the motet and the concerti movements that he had previously excluded. I haven't seen the Geoffrey Kurtzman edition for Oxford University Press, but I would expect it to be very fine indeed. And you might be amused to know that as an undergraduate, I had to beg the librarian of the music library at Cambridge University, the Canterbury Library, to allow me to photocopy pages from the Bassus Generalis part book of 1610. And he was very, very concerned about the binding, and I had great difficulty in getting permission to photocopy one of those part books. Well, you will be glad to know that very high quality scans and facsimiles can be found on the IMSLP server these days, free of charge. So these are some of the editions that you can obtain now. The second one is the Mösler edition. I still have my own precious copy wrapped in Cambridge Music Shop paper. And the Monteverdi Eulenburg edition of the Vespers, it's a large format full score. It's not a pocket-sized edition as the other Monteverdi scores. But the snag of this edition is that the editor has kept the original bars, which are sometimes very, very long. And if you consider that you have orchestral musicians who are counting rests, it's really rather difficult, because you then have to conduct, I don't know, not subdivided 4, but subdivided 8 even, if you are going to observe the bar lines that are there. I don't know what the instrumental parts that I believe you can hire to go with this edition look like. But for study purposes, the Eulenburg Monteverdi edition is very fine indeed. And it's a beautifully presented volume, and it has suggestions regarding the metrical proportional relationships that we talked about, done in accordance with Dr. Roger Bowers's theories. Now let's look at some of the protagonists in the musicology of the Monteverdi Vespers, and most of them edited their own editions. We already mentioned Gianfrancesco Malipiero, himself a Venetian composer and a composition professor. He taught the likes of Luigi Nono and Bruno Maderna. Hans Redlich, an émigré to the UK, was a very distinguished musician. He was not only involved in proofreading the Malipiero edition, but he was an opera conductor in Europe in his own right, a co-repetiteur, an opera. He was a pupil of Karl Orff. He even remembered meeting Gustav Mahler as a child, which pleasantly ties in this lecture to our very first lecture of this series, presentation of this series on Gustav Mahler's symphonies. So he came from that musically very, very rich Central European background. He conducted in Germany, then emigrated to England. He taught for a while at Edinburgh University. Then he became a professor at Manchester. And of course, as he wrote at the time, his editorial practices reflected the philosophy of the era. He said the modern edition has not only to reconstruct a complete orchestral score, but must add expression marks, alter time signatures, revalue cumbersome rhythms, and write out complete parts for the organ and harpsichord. These days, we have a more minimalist approach. We want to add as little as possible and to allow individual performers to make their own judgments and to fill out what may be missing on the basis of their own creativity, their own inclination, their own understanding of the style. As I said, the first Redlich edition was based on Malipiero, and the continuo had been realized in a very elaborate, complicated, and ornamented manner. Hans Scherchen, the conductor whom you see in this corner, of whom we spoke quite a lot in connection with the Bach Mass in B minor, because he was a superb Bach interpreter as well, used the first Redlich edition for a broadcast performance of the Monteverdi Vespers, broadcast on Swiss radio in 1943. And the same edition was used for the first UK performance supervised by the composer Michael Tippett at Morley College, but it was conducted by Walter Goer, the father of the composer Alexander Goer, in 1946. And the BBC broadcast the Redlich version in 1947. It was printed in 1949, as I said, but there was a revised version in 1952, and it was used for a recording in 1953 under Hans Grischkat. And you can find just one movement of this recording on YouTube, and this is what the LP records looked like. Now, the musicologist Leo Schrad wrote a very dismissive and damning review of this recording in the Music Quarterly, calling it arbitrary, inartistic, with deplorable features, over-romantic, with little musical taste and understanding of style, deviations from the original that are very serious. And of course, he was criticizing more than the performance itself, the recording, because he said, since the recording follows Redlich's score, the performance exhibits all the errors and shortcomings of that edition. In fact, the deplorable deficiencies of the performance are to a large extent due to the editorial arrangement used by the musicians. Now, to put this in perspective, there was a dispute, a musicological dispute between Hans Redlich and Leo Schrad of long-standing. Schrad produced his own edition as well, you see, and that too was performed. In retrospect, I think with hindsight, we can say that Redlich and Schrad could see different aspects of the truth. The Monteverdi Vespers are like a diamond, and those two men were gazing at the diamond from different angles. Schrad was much more aware of the liturgical aspects, and his writings show a sophisticated understanding of those. But he was very conservative and traditional in some ways, and he would see the 1610 set of publications as being rather like a sort of closed work, a monument, and Monteverdi's rubrics to be definitive, and all details as being indicative of a sort of completeness of the score, and it should be done as it stood, as he saw it. Redlich misunderstood the liturgical nature of the work and rather assumed that it was a loose collection of pieces with which you could match and mix and pick and choose, so to speak. But he was right in seeing it, at least from our present point of view, he was right in seeing it as being incomplete in terms of the performance practice of the time, requiring it to be filled out, or at least admitting some liberties in filling it out, which is a more modern approach. Of course, filling it out does not give us license to do what we want. It has to be done within certain parameters, and we now know more about what might be expected in that period, roughly speaking. Although we do not know very much about St. Mark's in Monteverdi's time, and we know even less about Mantua. Schrad, as I said, produced his own performing edition, and that was used for another recording. The edition was not published, but the recording was released also in 1953, and the BBC, being rather open-minded perhaps, gave both sets of performers the opportunity of broadcasting live performances in 1954. Schrad is also famous for a volume that I possess. It's called Monteverdi, the Creator of Modern Music, published in New York in 1950. This reminds me of another incident with Dr. Roger Bowers, the estimable musicologist and musical historian. I went to him to ask him something about Monteverdi again. And he said, well, of course, I don't know very much about modern music, but I shall try to answer your question. And at the time I was shocked that he considered Monteverdi modern. Little did I know that there was this book published many decades earlier called Monteverdi, Creator of Modern Music. Yet another incident with Roger Bowers, which I did not witness in person, but colleagues of mine, fellow students, told me one year when the college orchestra at Jesus College, Cambridge, was rehearsing Dvorak's New World Symphony, apparently Dr. Bowers entered the chapel and asked one of the students, what's all this racket? What's all this row about? And they said, oh, we are rehearsing the Dvorak New World Symphony, Symphony number 9. And apparently he said, oh, I can't stand this modern music, and he walked out. But ladies and gentlemen, for some, it's not just Dvorak who is modern music, but even Monteverdi. Now, Walter Goer, whom I mentioned, had conducted Redrick's earlier edition, but he too produced his own edition. This edition is not highly regarded now because he changed a lot of things. And Kurtzman's judgment is that Goer was a noted performer, not a scholar, and his efforts to render the music in a modern form, at least by the standards of his own time, proved rather clumsy. Well, Dennis Stevens omitted the concerti antiphons. He had to replace them by finding bits of Gregorian chant, antiphons in the same modes as the tones of each of the psalms and the Magnificat. But the weakness of that approach may be that the antiphons themselves that he chose don't actually correspond to any single liturgical service. Now, I shall quote from a really excellent book by Jeffrey Kurtzman, much more recent than the collection of essays that I acquired as a schoolboy. This was published in 2003. And in fact, up to a point, he cites Joshua Rifkin, whom we discussed in connection with Bach a few weeks ago. He mentions three main approaches that are open to us if we wish to perform the Monteverdi Vespers in a historically informed way. One way would be to pursue a sort of ideal performance, ideal in inverted commas, based as closely as possible to Monteverdi's notation and rubrics of instructions, what we know of the singers, players, and other conditions in which he worked. But we know very little of these conditions, as I said. And the second approach would be based on a broader understanding of the range of early 17th century performance practices. We have to consider the possibility that Monteverdi's Vespers would not always have been performed in the circumstances that he himself may have envisaged. Other musicians within the 17th century might have applied their own practices and even their own aesthetic criteria. Now, this approach requires us to make use of our knowledge of performance practice in Mantua, Venice, and further afield, but again, rarely do we get definite answers in our search for more detailed information. But there is yet a third approach, and in my opinion, this approach also is a valid one, and that is that modern performers may ignore this elusive fetish for authenticity and interpret the music using a trustworthy edition and interpreting the music much in the same way, with the same approach with which they would interpret the Verdi Requiem or the Brahms German Requiem. Now, this approach would probably be deemed to be less acceptable at present because it is not fashionable. But the alternative would be to allow 17th century historical criteria to dominate, and that seems to have resulted, sadly, in performances and especially recordings of the Monteverdi Vespers to be reserved to only a few specialist groups. And it has to be said that most modern performances fall somewhere in between the first two approaches of this elusive and maybe misleading conviction that you're pursuing authenticity. An ideal performance based on notation and sources, a sort of philological approach, treating the score as a monument, or the second approach that tries to gather as much information about a range of practices and try and move around within them, although these become rather elusive, rather nebulous, and allow a lot of scope for fashion masquerading as musicological knowledge. Although this may be a somewhat unkind way of looking at things. Now, let's look at the music itself. Well, it starts with fanfares, and of course, you will know that works such as the Charpentier Te Deum, the Dvorak Te Deum, and Janacek's Glagolitic Mass start with glorious fanfares in the beginning. Why? Well, probably because those instruments have been traditionally associated with angels. This is a picture. It's Fra Angelico's Last Judgment. It's a little close-up of part of the picture. And so Monteverdi, however, was, we might say, the daddy of them all. So this is how the Monteverdi Vespers start. This will be from perhaps one of my three favorite recordings, maybe the favorite recording, with a Lausanne Vocal and Instrumental Ensemble conducted by Michel Corboz's second recording of 1983. So that's how the Vespers open. The solo voice sings Deus in adjutorium meum intende. Versicle and response. Deus in adjutorium meum intende, make haste, O God, to deliver me. And then the doxology, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. And you heard the Alleluias at the end. And you will have noticed that mellow sound. These are the cornetti, these old, slightly curved wooden instruments. Now, the music was more or less, most of it was just a chord of D major. Around which the instruments were doing, they were weaving those fanfares. Now, where did this music come from? Published in 1610. Well, it actually came from an earlier work by Monteverdi, the opening toccata, as it was known, instrumental introduction to his opera Orfeo, and compare what we just heard with the opening of the opera that you will hear now. So you see, it is more or less exactly the same. So I shall endeavor to return to my presentation. So if we look at some of the most interesting recordings, and these are not all the recordings, this is a selection. We have the first three that came out in 1953. The very first one, which is just of some movements, was conducted by none other than Leopold Stokowski, whom we don't usually associate with Monteverdi, with a group of performers at the University of Illinois. Then there was the Hans Grischkat recording that I mentioned, and then the Oiseau-Lyre Orchestra, using two rival editions by Hans Redlich and by Leo Schrad, respectively. Next, the 1967 recording by Michel Corboz, the first of his two recordings, came out, and that is a very fine and treasurable recording that gives undiminished pleasure to my mind, and we shall hear a little bit from it. Amongst other things, it uses the distinguished Swiss tenor Hugo Queneau. And it's interesting to see that Jürgen, who produced and published an edition published by Universal in Vienna, recorded his own version. Robert Kraft, who is primarily associated with avant-garde music and for being Stravinsky's assistant, made his own recording. The Deller consort, associated with the distinguished countertenor Alfred Deller, made a recording. And the scholar and performer Dennis Stevens made a recording that you can get on CD now, which eschews the concerti, the motets, those movements he considered extraneous to Vespers. And all 5 of these recordings appeared in 1966. Some further recordings that are significant appear on this slide. The most interesting is perhaps the Schneid recording, although it's interesting to listen to the King's College Choir, the choir of King's College Chapel in Cambridge, Their first recording of the Monteverdi Vespers was done in 1976 with Philip Ledger. John Eliot Gardiner, he has been associated with the piece. He later recorded it in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, as we shall see, but he actually performed the work, I think, as a student, if I'm not mistaken. He has a long association with the piece. I'm not over fond of his interpretations personally, but they must not be ignored, nor must Nicolaus Harnoncourt, who I believe recorded the work twice, if not more. But in the meantime, two of my favorite recordings came out. The recording by Jean-Claude Malgoire, whose performance of Orfeo made such an impression on me in Montpellier when I was a schoolboy. And this recording is far from perfect. The choir, particularly the choir boys, they are not especially polished or disciplined, but much of the solo singing is very beautiful. The harp continuo is really exceedingly beautiful. The sound that is made, I think it was Catherine Johanel, on a small instrument. The sound is really magnificent. And Malgoire was a very fine Monteverdi interpreter. The tempi, the metrical relations, integral proportional relations between successive sections. He has all the right instincts, and it's recording that is dripping with musicality. And Nigel Rodgers sings very beautifully in this recording. Later on, he made his own. And the second of the two Corbeau's recordings is very, very fine, very different to that of Malgoire, but really treasurable, and I'm very, very fond of it. Let us proceed. Here is a summary of the most significant recordings. I should merely like to add one to what I've already mentioned, a recording that I acquired in 1984 with Andrew Parrott and a Taverner consort, whose performance of the Bach B minor Mass had enthralled me only 3 or 4 years before, and which tries to recreate a liturgical plan and which puts into practice Andrew Parrott's theories about the necessity for transposing some movements down a perfect fourth for some movements. Well, it was such a disappointment. I acquired the recording as soon as it came out, was very excited by it, but it was a bit of a letdown. Nonetheless, it's an important contribution. Now, I should briefly like to mention Dixon's proposal. I think it's Graham Dixon, if I am not mistaken, which you find in this recording made by the 16. It's a small vocal group under Harry Christophers. They were convinced that the Vespers were not intended necessarily to be sung at Marian feasts, but they were particularly suitable, according to Dixon, for a feast, for the feast of St. Barbara. And this recording tries to make a case for that. Other than Parrott, Philippe Hereweg, the Belgian conductor, also adopted the downward transpositions. And you see that in 1986, Harnoncourt made his second recording. That was a live performance. Some people prefer the early one, others the later one. John Eliot Gardiner made his second recording at St. Mark's Basilica, strictly speaking, not cathedral, but basilica, one ought to say. And Jürgen Jürgens made his second recording. But since then, numerous recordings, at least 39 recordings, if my count is correct, but more and more are appearing all the time, have mushroomed, but most of them sadly not of very great interest. It's interesting, in fact, to go backwards in time. For example, who would have said that there would be a historic recording with Eugen Jochum, which involves such distinguished and very fine opera singers, the very best of the day. Maria Städer, a fine Wagner singer, I think she even recorded the Dvorak Requiem, if I'm not mistaken. Walter Berry, whom you find in wonderful recordings of Beethoven's Fidelio, Mozart's Magic Flute under Klemperer, and so on and so forth. And Joachim was a superb interpreter of Bruckner, Haydn, Bach, and Nielsen. And you will find that some of the interpretative features associated with Corbeau's have their antecedents in some of the things, some of the decisions that Joachim made. This is a live recording, so it's not listed amongst the studio recordings that I listed before. I'm not entirely sure the year in which it was made, but it's worth exploring. You can find it on YouTube. Now, let us, I mentioned Hugues Queneau, and this is the historic reissue, of course, and this recording that was made in 1937 or thereabouts, with Nadia Boulanger at the piano, whom you can see here in a contemporary picture, and Blanche de Polignac. This is Nadia Boulanger rather later. This is a later reissue. That's how I acquired this recording. It was on CD already. So there is a freshness of discovery associated with those performers. Marvelous musicality of a sort that one rarely encounters, and we have to put Monsieur Queneau in a category of his own. I should like to play you a duet by Monteverdi, Zefiro Torna, where he is singing with Paul de Rennes and accompanied by Nadia Boulanger playing her own continuo reservation. We shall hear only a little of it because we need to listen to more of the Vespers rather than other things by Monteverdi, but I could not resist taking the opportunity of presenting you at least a little excerpt for a flavor. It's difficult to stop it, but one had to do so that we can get on with the Monteverdi Vespers. But you can see there is a certain purity of style that seems to go straight to the heart of the music, and yet at the same time a certain wholeheartedness that does not patronize the music, but which is legato, but nonetheless allows every word to be heard very, very clearly. It's something rather extraordinary, and in my view, it goes much closer to the spirit of the music than some of these artificial styles of performance we now associate with so-called historically informed performance, which has something rather precious about it in not a positive sense, and which sounds so much like a tradition I greatly value and love, the Anglican sort of collegiate style of singing and cathedral style of singing, but which is not Italian at all, and which it seems to me rather far-fetched to try and apply to Monteverdi, of all people. Now, here's Huguenot singing Nigra Sum. I am dark but comely, I am black but comely, from the Solomon's Song of Songs, from the Monteverdi Vespers. This is from Corboz's first recording of the Monteverdi Vespers in 1967. So that was Hugues Queneau singing Nigra Sum from the Monteverdi Vespers of 1610 with Michel Corboz in the 1967 recording that they made together. Surge, surge, amica mea, rise up, my beloved, from the Song of Songs. Now, I should like to pass on to another movement of the Vespers. Again, it's one of those movements whose legitimacy in the Monteverdi Vespers had been disputed for a good while. It is Duo Seraphim, the two seraphim. But then the two become three with the addition of a third voice in a marvelous bit of world painting, so they can sing Sanctus, Sanctus, Holy, Holy. Now, Nigel Rodgers, who sings here, took part in one of my favorite recordings, the one with Malgoire. He was also a very fine interpreter of Monteverdi's Orfeo. He sings with John Elwys in the Malgoire recording and with Winfred Evans in the second Corboz recording. But this is with his own ensemble known as Chiaroscuro, and I should like you to listen, please. Oops. So, that's better. So let's try again. So that was Nigel Rogers and two other tenors singing duo Seraphim, the two seraphim, the two seraphs, who then become three, tre sunt, and they sing Sanctus, Sanctus, Sabaoth, Holy, Holy, Lord God of hosts. Now, I'm not entirely sure anymore if that was recorded with chiaroscuro, because I saw something else on the description on the YouTube CD cover. I'm not entirely sure, but Nigel Rogers was certainly singing and he was directing. Now we turn to the Malgoire recording, Malgoire directing La Grande Écurie, La Chambre du Roi. And here we have Nigel Rogers singing Audicelum with the other excellent Monteverdi tenor, John Elwys, singing the echo voice. It's one of those effects that would have been quite magical in the space of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. A sort of echo effect that we have also towards the end of Monteverdi's Orfeo. And note the lovely glowing silvery sound of the harp in this recording. Let's hear at least some of this to give you a flavor.
Nel
I'm so sorry, I have to stop it there as we don't have so much time available. It's a mystery who wrote the words to this poem that praises the beauty of the Virgin Mary. Pulchra ut luna, beauteous as the moon, electa ut sol. But you get the idea about what a fine interpretation this is. We do not have sufficient time for me to be able to play you the Magnificat as recorded by Malgoire. Just trying to proceed to the next slide. Let's see if I shall be able to do so. Ah, yes. So I'll just play the beginning of it. It lasts about 20 minutes and it is on YouTube, so you may be able to find it. So just the opening of it. So that is the opening of the Malgoire 1981 recording of the Monteverdi Magnificat. By the way, the Joachim live recording that was not listed apparently was made in 1957, that I was able quickly to check out. Now, Malgoire recorded this Magnificat, Corbeau's, who recorded the Vespers twice, in his first recording of 1967, recorded both the Magnificats that are associated with the Vespers, the 6-voice one, which we heard now in the Malgois version, and the 7-voice one. In his second recording of 1983, he did not unfortunately include the 6-voice one, and the 6-voice one is my favorite. It's the one that I've conducted thrice in different places at different times in my life. But someone apparently managed to record a rehearsal of a concert that Corboz was preparing as recently as 2001, well, recent as these things go, with his Lausanne Vocal Ensemble. And I should like us to hear a little bit of that. And if you have time, you can find the 1967 recording and compare it. It is rather different, although the same musicality and sense of flow may be found here as well. But sadly, although Corboz fairly recently re-recorded, for example, the Mass in B minor numerous times, there doesn't seem to have been a more recent recording of the Monteverdi Vespers more recently than 1983. So that makes this live recording of a rehearsal from 2001 of the 6-voice Magnificat all the more interesting. Let's hear at least a little bit. So this happens to be the very same bit that we heard in the Malgois recording. And in the Malgois recording, the choir boys were perhaps slightly flat under the note. Those ladies singing under Corboz were much more accurate. But I prefer the tempo and the atmosphere, especially the Et exultavit at the slightly slower tempo. It sounds a little older, it sounds a little more from the Renaissance, and it sort of has a greater spiritual depth, it seems to me, than doing it at this faster and virtuoso tempo. Fine though it is, of course. Now, let us proceed to my last excerpt for this evening. It is from the 1983 recording with Corboz of the Vespers. It's unlike the other examples which were from the motets or from the concerti that some people had considered to be extraneous to Vespers, although it seems that they were proved wrong later on. This is the psalm Letatus Sum, and let's hear it in this recording. So that was Letatus sum. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord, a famous psalm. Probably it will be known to many of you as Psalm 122, although for Monteverdi it would, I think, have been, according to the Vulgate, Psalm 121. Note some of the lovely touches. You can tell Corboz was conducting the Gloria, 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 Gloria Patri. How the Gloria was connected to the Patri et Filio. Often you find that many people do Gloria, a gap, Patri et Filio, but to whom is glory being given or praise being given? It is Gloria Patri, glory to the Father, and Corboz links that. He does the same in his recording of the Bach Magnificat. I always wince if I go to a concert and they perform the Bach Magnificat and they separate the Gloria from the ensuing Patri. I'm very grateful to say that when I performed it with the Charles University Chorus, naturally we connected the Gloria to the Patri. And the performers were, this was the second Corboz recording of 1983. I bought it a little bit later as a student. I see that I purchased it from Heffer's and it cost me $13.75 at the time. I still have the box. And it was Michel Corboz with his Ensemble Vocal de Lausanne and a group of instrumentalists on period instruments. And the soloists whom you did hear in this movement were Jennifer Smith, Audrey Michael, sopranos, the splendid tenors Winford, Evans, John Elwis, and Philippe Huten-Locher, the baritone, and Michel Brodard, the bass. So if I were forced to pin myself down and recommend just a single recording of the Monteverdi Vespers, it would probably have to be this one. That was my last excerpt for this evening's lecture. For further reading, I would recommend these books, most of which I've mentioned, books and articles, particularly if you can get the Jeffrey Kurtzman volume, first published in 1999 and reprinted in 2003, OUP Oxford University Press. That is the most up-to-date scholarly treatment of the various musicological issues and the history of the interpretation of the piece. But also a very nice volume indeed, perhaps slightly out of date now, but still a very good thing to have, covering Monteverdi in general and including excerpts from his letters. It's the more recent edition, the 1985 edition, Arnold and Fortune, the new Monteverdi Companion. The old edition was the Monteverdi Companion. I should like to end by quoting what Dennis Stevens wrote in connection with the 1967 Corboz recording of the Monteverdi Vespers. And that he did despite the fact that at the time he still believed that the motets and the concerto movement, so to speak, ought to be omitted. Nonetheless, he said, when we listen to the Vespers, in the order of the printed editions, we cannot help being struck by the grandiose architectural design, so carefully thought out, which is responsible for this sequence of masterpieces. The judicious alternation of smaller and larger works, the progression of each category independently of the other, the variety in tonality, for we may speak of tonality in the modern sense rather than of modes, all this goes to show that the Vespers are not simply a collection of magnificent pieces, but a great and unified conception, a monument comparable in importance and grandeur with Bach's B minor Mass. I hope that this presentation may have helped this magnificent music come more alive for you. I imagine some of you may already know and love it, but for others, perhaps this modest presentation may have been your first introduction to it, in which case I envy you, because there is nothing like hearing it for the first time. It is at the same time a shocking and surprising masterpiece, but one that is superbly satisfying and inspiring. I say I envy you the freshness of discovery. On the other hand, let me say that each time one hears or performs this music, one gets a little deeper. One's brain, or whatever it is, it's not the brain, it's one's musicality. I don't know, difficult to put a finger on it because it's very intuitive, but you start to feel more the inner connections, the marvelous coherence of it. So yes, the first time you hear it, there's this magnificent excitement and freshness of discovery, but there are dividends for repeated listenings and study over a period of years as well, in terms of a fuller enjoyment. A more searching exploration leads to really a more profound appreciation and a more profound enjoyment, I think. I hope that we have been able to demonstrate its highly sophisticated construction, which caused a lot of confusion and controversy in the 20th century. And you will be aware now of some of the decisions that you may have to make if you are involved in a performance of it. But above all, I hope that you were able to savor and enjoy some of those delightful specimens from its brief but very, very varied and rich history of interpretation. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. And now I should like to ask if we have any questions, and accordingly, I shall now stop sharing my screen. Do please not be shy and don't hesitate to ask me anything if there's something on which you might like to have some fuller explanation. Any thoughts that may have occurred to you as you listen to these excerpts?
I have a question for you.
Oh, excellent, Tom.
I've performed the entire work in 1972, and with the Mösler edition, and I found this was the first exposure to Mensorstrich.
Yes.
And I found it extremely useful. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that as a the use of that as a performance guide, especially in something which I consider so, what the term I would use is syncopated.
Yes. Now, and it becomes explicitly syncopated if you don't use Mensorstrich and you have long bars, in which case you have things that are tied, and visually the effect is not the same. So if you don't have an edition that has this Mensorstrich, you have to, you must insistently tell your singers and players, ladies and gentlemen, it looks different, but it's the same. You have to treat it the same way. So it's ti-pa-pam, whether it is ti-ta-tam, or whether it is ti-ta-ta, it's the imitation that counts. It's the same thing. But on the other hand, if you give them an edition that has Mensorstrich, they will protest, they'll get lost, they will say, what is this? It seems to, there's a dot in the beginning of the bar, and they may have difficulty in counting. I don't think it is now fashionable to use Mensorstrich, or some editions have it for the score from which the conductor or director directs, but the parts are often written out in a more conventional way. But I never used the Mösler edition, the Gottfried Wolters edition in performance. So I didn't know that the parts reproduced this feature. And I'm delighted that if you played it, you were one of those people who appreciated it, rather than one of those people who would complain to the conductor saying that I can't read this, what is it? But there's another context in which something like Mensorstrich is encountered. the old editions of Elizabethan, Tudor church music, edited by Edmund Fallows, William Byrd, and that kind of thing, though they did not use Menserstricht in that the bar lines did cross the staves, nonetheless, when there was a dotted rhythm across the bar, across the measure, they would treat it as Menserstricht and put a dotted crotchet, a dotted quarter note, and place the dot in the next measure, which again, you have to use and sing from such material a few times, 2 or 3 times, and then you get used to it. You're at ease with it, and you appreciate the fact that it makes the structure much more transparent, because it makes it immediately obvious that there's imitation, but the rhythm is the same. It is the same motif that is being imitated, and therefore it is appropriate to interpret it in a similar way. Whereas most modern day musicians, they would be apt to treat a dot differently from a tied note. And Paul Eswood, I remember being present at a masterclass that he gave at Dartington many years ago, quoting Harnoncourt, saying a dot equals the rest. It was because of Harnoncourt's penchant for doing di, da, di, da, di, so di, ra, di, ra, di. Now, that's taking things to extremes, and some of Harnoncourt's recordings are a little mannered because of that. But I dare say, almost certainly, Harnoncourt was reliant on his musicians either having parts that used Menserstricht or having an acute awareness of the fact that something tied to something else across the bar line was tantamount to a dotted rhythm uninterrupted by a bar, and they should treat it in the same way. So if indeed you were going to create a little gap, or put a little bit of air during the dot of a dotted rhythm, then you ought to do it to the same extent when the same thing has been written across the bar line, across the measure, in the form of a tied note. Mm-hmm. It was Sir Thomas Beecham, after all, I think, who used to say, ladies and gentlemen, play phrases, don't play bars or measures. They are just the little boxes in which the music arrives. That's the packing of it. But the music itself knows no bars. And I too often tell my performers, ladies and gentlemen, imagine that there's a huge jar full of treacle or honey or some such sweet viscous liquid, and someone has somehow carelessly kicked that jar, and that treacle, that honey, has started to flow. And that's how the music should go. That honey does not know bar lines. That honey does not know beats. It's just flowing. Because after all, music has its meaning. Individual notes by themselves, in my view, do not have meaning. The meaning is acquired by virtue of the connection that one note has with the ensuing note and with the preceding note. And it is the way they're connected and the history of it and the memory of it that builds up certain cumulative tensions, and those tensions are meaningfully and satisfyingly resolved. That is how all music works, in my opinion. And breaking it and regimenting it and making the performers sound like a marching army destroys the music, unless, of course, you're performing a march.
I'd say no place is that truer than in this work. This is the epitome of that in my whole musical experience. No place is it truer, especially, and I should say that I performed this in that instance as a vocalist, not an instrumentalist.
Right. In which case you could have had the Walters edition, every member of the choir. Yes,
indeed we did. I treasure that.
Indeed, this brings back memories. Thank you for that. There's another thing that occurs to me, which is we have a tendency nowadays, because you said this work is the epitome of that. It's the epitome of a lot of things. It's one of the peaks of Western civilization. It is entirely comparable to the Bach Mass in B minor, which was the theme of the second of those weekly motivational sessions on interpretation, repertoire and interpretation that I've been running, primarily for the chorus and orchestra of Charles University, but for sister groups and friends all over the world, which is the following. It is good that musicology has recently allowed us to unearth a lot of pieces that shed a lot of indirect light. For example, the Vespers that Kurtzman uncovered, which explicitly had the little concerti, the little motets, in lieu of antiphons, clarified the structure, and it made it clear that for Monteverdi's 1610 publication also these pieces could legitimately be included instead of plain chant antiphons. We heard a plain chant antiphon before the Corbeau's 1983 L'État to Sum movement that I played a few minutes ago. And the same you could say with Bach, that there's a tendency now to put Johann Sebastian Bach in the context of what else was going on around him, before him, and after him. Nonetheless, I still think there's a case for considering these works as singularities, as masterpieces, as works of genius that are unrepeatable. I could say similar things in philology. For example, we have amongst us the leading world authority on the works of St. Gregory of Narek in the person of Professor Abraham Derian. And increasingly, there's a tendency of looking at other things that were done within the same circles by lesser masters. They are useful. They shed light on the big masterpieces that those geniuses created, such as St. Gregory of Narek. But in my limited time, I'm not interested in listening to or reading some of those lesser lights, good as they might be, when they are overshadowed by these truly monumental masterpieces. If you have tasted of the true fountain, if you have diamonds, or if you've got 24 karat gold, then those things really belong in a class of their own. And we should not just treat them as one amongst many other things. They are not equal. They are peerless. These are gigantic things in terms of their stature, and they are the things that help one not lose hope in humanity. I would go so far as to say they are divinely inspired. We could argue about that. I'd say yes, you might say no. But I would say that certainly no one would dispute that they are manifestations of genius and the human spirit at its very best. And therefore, I'm inclined to perform them as such. And someone who is used to performing a different work every weekend by other composers from the same era may have a different approach and may find my approach excessively reverential. But I'm not excessively reverential in the sense that, and you hear that in Corbeau's as well, and various others, they perform it wholeheartedly, in a full-blooded way, putting everything in it, passion as well as the intellect. So that is my approach to music, and of course Monteverdi and the Vespers are one of the things that are closest to my heart. But ladies and gentlemen, naturally you're not here to hear my personal opinions. What I hope I was able to present is something reasonably objective, although of course it was selective and to that extent subjective, but a reasonably objective description of what musicology has had to say about this piece. and the sorts of considerations we need to have in mind if we are planning to perform the work, and various aspects of it that one might appreciate upon hearing different performances and recordings, because there is no single way of doing things, and indeed we know that even the same performers, upon performing it on different occasions or recording it, the gap of a few years, look at it in different ways. Although even in such cases, when you're listening to the performances of great masters, and you find that their tempi have changed or other aspects have changed over the years, it is nonetheless very, very interesting to observe certain things that have remained in common, certain things that have remained invariant. Do we have any other questions? Well,
not a question, but a request.
yes.
I'm one of those privileged ones who heard these things for the first time.
I envy you. I envy you.
Anyway, could you forward to me a reference to that beautiful duet which you interrupted with Nadia?
Nadia Boulanger at the piano, yeah. Hugues Queneau and Paul de Rennes. Yes, indeed.
I think that was heavenly. Just
indeed, heavenly. Indeed it was. Yes, yes, so true. Well, I'm so delighted, Abraham, that you feel the same way about it as I. Not only I, generations.
Thank you for sharing.
Generations of listeners have gone mad over Monteverdi upon hearing those recordings. Made in 1937 and thereabouts. They have never left the catalog. They initially appeared as small records that rotate 78 RPM. And they then appeared as LPs, that's how I got them. And then as CDs, and of course they're out of copyright and different companies have released them. You can find them on YouTube as well. I should be very pleased to send you a link to a YouTube version. And you can still order the CD in various different incarnations if you wish. I'm delighted to hear about it. And I believe that Corboz also acquired his love of Monteverdi from those recordings. You see, at the time, in 1937, there was nothing else of Monteverdi recorded. And so people had their first acquaintance with the music, unless they had access to an old archive or a library, and they could pore over the old part books of 1610 or the very brief excerpts that had been published. I cannot now remember which year the Malipiero edition came out. It may have been around the same time. But of course, Nadia Boulanger did not record any of the Vespers movements in that. It's secular madrigals. But it was more or less the only Monteverdi that people could hear. And the good lady was very astute. She was a very distinguished composition teacher, of course, herself. She was also a fine composer who studied with Gabriel Fauré. And Fauré wished to encourage her, but she always felt herself to be a lesser composer than her late younger sister, Lili Boulanger, who passed away tragically at the age of 26 or 27. And she deserves a motivational Zoom session on repertoire and interpretation in her own right. But Nadia Boulanger was a very, very musical and musicianly person. And she chose the music very judiciously, what could be included in this set of 78. And she accompanies it with sensitivity. And though it is the solo singers that are singing, but you're never under any mistake, the good lady was in total control over what was done and how it was done. And the singers had this amazing style of performance. And Madame de Polignac, I'm not sure if she was the Princesse de Polignac or the Comtesse de Polignac, or she was an aristocrat by marriage. I think she was an aristocrat, but she married into the singer company, I think. And Hugues Queneau played chamber music with her or with her mother, I'm not sure. The Chansons de Venise by Fauré, which were composed at their home. So this is an environment and the circles where she operated, where the most distinguished culturally and musically. And much of that you can feel in this recording, which is so wholehearted. And yet the singing is not a sort of, you don't get operatic bulldozers shrieking their heads off. It's very refined. It's refined, but it's not artificially restrained. Oh my goodness, I mustn't let it be too romantic. It's not the style. They're giving everything they've got, but within certain parameters that are so much at one with the music. So thank you for your most encouraging observation, and I shall gladly send you a link as soon as this session is complete. And another friend who has been present has written to me privately saying these are soothing angelic voices. Very much so. I think so. And I have listened to the Monteverdi Vespers at different times in my life with great voracity, although in recent years I save it up for special occasions. It's not something you can play in the kitchen as background music any more than the Bach Mass in B minor is. But even at times in my life or of great challenges, this is music that really gives one strength, and it is full of a certain, it's so banal to say it's full of energy. All sorts of things are full of energy, and they don't, but it's full of a spiritual kind of inner strength and vigor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope that you do not confine yourself to those magical recordings with Nadia Boulanger, but you also proceed to dip a toe in deeper waters, shall we say, by looking at the Monteverdi Vespers of the Blessed Virgin of 1610, and also, and Corboz made a complete recording, I think it's on 10 CDs, originally on LPs. The bulk of Monteverdi's sacred music belongs to a collection called Selva Morale e Spirituale. And there's a huge amount of music. Some of it seems to demand large choral forces. Some of it consists of motets for a single voice or duets or smaller formations. But it is all 24-karat gold. And it has enormous internal variety. You will not find it monotonous. In fact, everything Monteverdi wrote, I mean, he may have written things that are bad, but if he did, they didn't reach us. In fact, almost certainly he wrote a lot of magnificent music that did not reach us. We know that most of his operas, alas, perished during fires. So in terms of his operas, what we have is just the tip of the iceberg. A tragedy for humanity, one of the greatest tragedies in Western music, comparable to Mozart's premature demise. And Henri Duparc's premature loss of creativity. That man composed 16 songs and duets and a couple of very short, slight pieces. And that was it. He was not able to write anything more. But on the strength of this handful of songs, his reputation rests. And it's another pinnacle of all music. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank you for your attention. To remind you that we have 2 more sessions with my good friend, indeed he's a fine friend of our chorus and orchestra as well, the distinguished pianist Bella Hartmann, who is such a wonderful Schubert interpreter, amongst other things. And the final session devoted to the work of one of my favorite conductors, Otto Klemper. Very much hope to see you for those 2 further sessions as well. With the same recurring Zoom link that enabled you access to this evening's session. Thank you so very much, both for your attention, for motivating me to produce those sessions, which I hugely enjoy doing, and for the pleasure of having your feedback and being able to respond to your questions. Thank you very much indeed. Be well, and see you in a week's time. A very good evening to you.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomasz.